Today, we are going to discuss the rape of the lock. But before we begin a particular text or whichever it might be, a novel, a poem, a drama, we try and know the author a bit. And we try to know about the author. Okay, just hold on for a second. Okay. Yeah. So we first introduce ourselves to the author. This age, which is popularly the age to which Rape of the Lock as a poem belongs, is popularly known as the Augustan Age, Neoclassical Age, Age of Reason. So it has very many names, this particular age. But then Pope was a prominent figure of this age. And many a times, we also refer to this age by calling it Age of Pope, because he was that big a figure in this age. And not the span of time that he lived, 1688 to 1744. I mean, the active period, out of which the active period of his literary life is popularly known as the Age of Pope. Pope's importance, however, extends beyond his own age, because he has continued to engage people across generations, across centuries. And the main task that Pope performs is that he, many a times, he goads us, he persuades us to clarify and articulate our difference with literature itself. He, in a way, this age becomes crucial because it is also trying to define literature. Every age does that. I mean, just right now, you were being questioned about the time period of different ages. That's for convenience sake. That, I mean, we, in order to understand history, we have to segment it. We have to divide it. And the popular method that has been applied is to identify a particular age by certain characteristic features, or by the rulers who ruled that age. I mean, whichever is more dominant. And we believe in this segmentation because it makes our task as students and teachers of literature more convenient. I mean, we are able to then understand a particular text, a particular author in context of the age that he or she belongs to. So therefore, although this age is Augustan age, this is Neoclassical age, but since we are focusing on Pope, we would also see that Pope himself was such a figure that his age came to be identified with his name. In that particular age, an important satirist of that age was also Dryden. So most of you might be familiar with Dryden, although he has been removed from the syllabus. So Dryden had written Macflecknoe, he had written Absalom and Achitophel. So he is considered to be somebody who gave rise to this genre called satire and even mock epic poems. But it was carried through by Pope. Pope is the one who carried it through further, and therefore we call this age the Age of Pope. Now, this was a period which was seeing a radical change in reading public and its prospects. It was a kind of watershed moment for the English society. This period of beginning from the middle 17th century to the 18th century. It was a period of post-Civil War. The 17th century had seen a civil war which had caused a lot of unrest in English society. So this period following the Civil War wanted a kind of harmony in society. It wanted to see people being united. It did not want any kind of discord. And therefore, we would see that the genres that became popular in this age are different. I mean, this is the reason why we will have mock epic, why we will have satire. And the earlier forms are no longer considered to be viable in this particular age. You see that there is a gradual disappearance of drama. Dryden tried his hands at writing drama, but then it was not successful. In fact, as per reports, I mean, as when you read about this age, the critics remark that when tragedy was staged, at the end of tragedy, if a hero died, people would just laugh at it. So, such was the kind of irreverence that had suddenly grown in people, that they were no longer moved by even a tragedy. So poet had to think of new genres that could be read by the increasing reading public, because the reading public was increasing. Literacy level had improved in England. People had more money to spend on leisure. People wanted to read a lot. And one of the defining features was that for the first time in this century, poets no longer had to be entirely dependent on patron. That prior to this century, poets had to be dependent on patron. Only then they could write their work. But suddenly now there was a growing market and there was a growing readership on which a particular author could rely to earn his living. Pope was one of those. I mean, Pope is considered to be unique in the sense that Pope was somebody who is considered to have had complete control over his finances, and he was dependent on market to earn his living. Not that he did not have patrons and supporters. Of course, to begin with, he had, but market was was the sustainable source from where he gained his income. Uh, let's come to Pope. Pope as a person. So, who was this person named Pope? Pope, he was mostly derided by his contemporaries. People called him a hunchback toad. There were people around him who believed that he was not just hunchback, he was twisted in mind as well. So that was because Pope was crippled in his adolescence. At the age of 14, he had a tuberculosis of the spine, and that led to permanent crippling. And he was in pain and discomfort throughout his life. And also, so that in a way occasioned a kind of inclusion from society. He became excluded from the regular circle of people, that he was not able to be a part of regular social gathering. His physical difference marked him in such a way. But apart from that, another crucial thing about Pope was that he belonged to he was a Roman Catholic. And in an age when Roman Catholics had begun to face increasing prejudices in society. So he was an outsider owing to his physical appearance, and he was an outsider because of his religious background. So he was brought up a Roman Catholic at a time when Roman Catholics were pretty disadvantaged in England. There were laws against Roman Catholic who they were not allowed to live in the center of London. So his father, in fact, took a residence at Twickenham. Because he was a religious outsider and he was always suspected by people. And since he was a religious outsider, he was always expected that he was anti-monarchy, he was anti-ministry, he was anti-politics. So this sentiment had aroused once especially after the Jacobean Revolution, that these people, they were considered to be Pope and the fellow Catholics, they were considered to be supporters of the Jacobean revolutions. They were called Jacobites. And therefore, they faced a kind of marginalization from the mainstream of English society. And therefore, Pope's Catholicism, it bounded him in many ways than one. So for one, he was bounded by his physical disability, and then he was equally bounded by his religion, more so in fact, because here it excluded him from a normal civil life. He couldn't attend any of the universities. Oxford and Cambridge, they were not allowing people of Catholic background to get entry. He was excluded from any kind of advancement in different other careers. So in that way, he was profession. So Pope, therefore, always saw himself as an outsider. He saw himself as an outsider to the mainstream cultural current of his time. And therefore, he developed a kind of inwardness because he started to live through books. He started to see the world through books. He was mostly shorn of company. So therefore, his vision of the world would be mediated by the books that he read. And eventually, he developed quite a hostile and combative existence through books and poetry. And therefore, we see that since he had been debarred from any kind of professional career, so writing was the only alternative that was left for Pope to make his living out of. So he could make his living only out of writing. And while he was writing, while he was still polishing his writing, and he did not have very many companions, Pope's companions were mostly elderly people. Those people had to be very intelligent, and they had to be potential patrons. They mostly were writers of an earlier age, and there developed a pattern in Pope of flattering these people. He would mostly flatter them into patronage, but he was the one who had the talent, who had the ambition. So Pope started writing from the age of 16. And by the time he was 21, he was already a published author. He was already getting published. His essay on criticism was published in 1711. His essay on man and pastorals, they all had got published. They all had got published before Rape of the Lock. So now this particular poem, Rape of the Lock, what is it about? This poem is based on an actual incident that took place in the aristocratic society of England. So there was this girl named Arabella Fermor. She and Lord Peter, they had a skirmish of sort, and that skirmish led to a family feud between the two families. And that became an occasion when the two families, they were at loggerheads with each other. And a person named John Carroll, who happened to be Pope's friend, pitched in behalf of the two families, and he asked Alexander Pope to write something so as to cause a reconciliation between the two families, so that the two families could reconcile to each other. So it was this that initiated the main context of this poem, an actual incident. So this poem is written in a mock epic, mock heroic format. So what is mock epic? Mock epic is, a mock epic was, again, it was written by Dryden earlier. Dryden had written Absalom and Achitophel, which was mock epic. So mock epic encouraged that good sense and good humor were not heroic virtues any longer. And good sense and good humor were the heroic virtues of this new age. And this is what Pope wanted to endorse. Now, as I said, that drama was not being written. Epic poem, which was considered to be a high form, that was read by people of this age. But the writers of this age believed that this particular form, epic, was no longer tenable in 18th century England, that they could no longer write such a form, because epic was about high-standing subject. It dealt with martial art. It dealt with wars and battles. It was about virtues which they believed had disappeared from English society. It aimed for a kind of grandeur which the English society was once again not seeking. At this particular juncture, what they were seeking was good sense and good humor, so that rationality could prevail, so that there could be an order in the society. And to this effect, the poets would then also go on to bring about a change in the kind of language that they would write. That they would write in a meter. They would write in. They would use a kind of vocabulary that were polished and refined. But once again, they were not aiming for something which was beyond the reach of humans. The order was the order of the day. Mock epic registers a kind of amusement at tradition and the typical classical epic which it parodies. Now, Rape of Lock has a number of epic features. For example, the subject, which is the heroine, she is introduced in an epic manner. The subject, heroine, Belinda herself, she arms herself like an epic hero does. Again, in this particular poem, you have sylphs to replace the Homeric gods and goddesses. There are epic games. So instead of battle, here you have card games between men and women. You also have heroic speeches. And then there is travel to the underworld, one of the most important features of epic poetry. And here that has been replaced by Cave of Spleen. So the chief purpose of mock heroic was to satirize the contemporary manners and attitude. As Pope himself said, that use of pompous expression for low action is the perfection of mock epic. Use of pompous expression for low action was the chief purpose of mock epic. Since Dryden had very recently translated Aeneid into English, so that provided a rich resource for the many references that we are going to find in this poem. And you see that this particular poem, it will employ rich expressions for rather inappropriate and trivial action. The 18th century reader was very keen. I mean, it had a very keen sense of proper decorum, and it was easily able to identify this discrepancy between the style and manner, that such grand flowing language was used for a subject matter which was so trivial. So mock epic, mock heroic, therefore, it works by exaggerating. It works by exaggerating disproportion in order to reassert proportion. So in order to bring about a kind of proportion, it works by exaggerating disproportion. However, if the reader is not able to mark this discrepancy, then the entire humor falls flat. Because if you do not know the Greek and Latin references that the author is going to make in the poem, then the poem will not have the same effect for you as it had for the 18th century reader. But again, most people call this poem a satire, that it is a satire. But then when we talk about mock epic or mock heroic, the aim of mock epic and mock heroic is not merely to satirize, because what mock epic does is that it elevates as well as it diminishes. So that when you are introduced to the heroine, Belinda, you see that Pope almost presents her as a goddess, that she is presented as somebody who is so beautiful that it evokes a kind of reverence for her beauty. But at the same time, the readers, they are also encouraged to laugh at her follies. So it works both ways. It exaggerates the trivial qualities by both elevating the character as well as diminishing them. So this is what mock epic means. So now I think that we should get to the poem. Yeah. And the time when Pope was writing this particular poem, he was staying in Windsor Forest, and he had become acquainted with the neighboring Catholic families, that there were smaller group of Catholic people. So most of them, they knew each other. So he had become close to these two sisters. And the two sisters were Martha and the two Blount sisters. The Martha was one of them. So this girl, the one who appears as a character of the poem, Arabella Fermor, she is the cousin of Martha. And that's how Pope comes to know about them. And John Carroll is also a common friend to both Arabella Fermor family as well as the Lord Peter family. So he will try and occasion the reconciliation between the two families. So let's come to this poem. Now, the first edition of this poem was written in 1712, and it was written in 2 cantos. So when Pope writes this poem, he sends a copy of this poem to Arabella Fermor to seek her approval, because unless she had, Carroll was godfather of Martha. So unless he had sought Arabella's approval, he couldn't have gone ahead with the poem. So he sends a copy to Arabella Fermor, and as per Pope's conversation with John Carroll, Pope says that Arabella Fermor was not very happy with the kind of depiction she found of herself in the poem, which rather surprised Pope. So Arabella was not happy, and yet she had to give her the approval for the publication of this poem, because even otherwise, unpublished copies would have found a way into the market. Piracy, as we call it today. So while the first edition of the poem was written, and it did also, that Pope suddenly saw that people were already reading his poem. That's when he had to edit the poem, he had to make changes to the poem, and then it's when that he introduces the supernatural machinery. That in the next edition, which was written in 1714, the one which we are going to study, he introduced a very elaborate supernatural machinery, and with the help of that machinery, and it's in the second edition that the poem actually takes the form of mock epic. And with the help of that supernatural machinery, Pope will mark this poem as a mock heroic, mock epic poem. So when we read this second edition, prior to the poem, there is a preface, and this preface is addressed to Arabella Fermor. Again, in this particular preface, as you would read it, it's first, before the preface, you see that there is an epigraph of in the poem, and that epigraph is written in Latin. So once again, the poet here is trying to show off, in a way, his acquisition of classical language. And this is what the poets of this age were trying to do, that they were well versed in Latin, and they would try and flaunt it. So the poet here, the epigraph is written in Latin. And it was also because this was a new classical age. They were deriving a lot from the classical literature. And in order that their derivation could be authentic, it could be genuine, they also had to quote verbatim from a previous Latin classical text. And in this particular preface, Pope would praise Arabella Fermor, and he seems to be asking for her permission to go ahead with the poem, which has been written about her. Of course, this poem had already been written. It was already published. But still, a certain decorum had to be followed. So the lady in question, she had to, her consent was required. So this is where Pope seeks her consent in the preface by praising her in grandstanding terms. And then further, we will come to the poem. So you can read the preface on your own. We are not going to, and even, okay, let me just make a few points about the preface. That it is in the preface that Pope mentions about the machinery, that he is going to follow a Rosicrucian philosophy. So now, since it is a mock epic form, Pope is not going to use the usual gods and goddesses. So there's going to be an alternative system for it. And this alternative system is what Pope himself did not create. Rather, there was an already available system called Rosicrucian system. So he influences, he derives all his supernatural machinery from the Rosicrucian system. Apart from that, in the preface, apart from that, in the preface, he also talks about the follies and foibles of this age, that he invites people to pay attention to what he is going to discuss in the poem, as to how he is going to highlight the trivialities of this age. So his age rather befuddled Pope. He believed that on one hand, of course, there was this sentiment of being able to execute order, of maintaining peace, but at the same time, uh, it also bothered the authors of this age that people in this age, especially people from the aristocratic society, they did not have anything worthwhile to do. So they were mostly whiling their time away, and it had led to a kind of decadence in aristocratic society. So Pope here will base this poem around the idea of decadence of aristocratic society. So, what are the men and women of aristocratic society doing in this age? Because they did not have to look for any kind of occupation. They were rich people. They had enough money. So, what were these youngsters doing? So, with all their energies, with all their ambition, how, and where were they channeling their energy and ambition to? So, this is what he's going to talk about. Yeah, so Canto 1 is what we are to discuss today. Now, in the Canto 1, following the epic format, the poet would begin by invocation of the muse. So, in the epic poetry, whether you had Homer's Iliad, the two epic poems which would mostly be referred to here are Homer's Iliad and Virgil's Aeneid. So how did the epic poetry begin? Epic poetry began with an invocation of muse. Muse were goddesses of poetry, and they had to be invoked by the poet so that the poet could receive their blessings and then carry on with the task of creation. So the act of creativity was not, they were still not living in a secular world. So they still believed that unless they were blessed by the goddesses, they couldn't attempt a creative task. So, in order for them to begin a creative task, they had to have the blessings of the muses. So, in this particular canto, we see that the poet begins with an invocation of the muses. So, I'll read these lines to you. What dire offense from amorous causes springs? What mighty contests rise from trivial things? Right at the outset, poet has defined what he has set out to do. What dire offense from amorous causes spring? That, you know that amorous, the word itself, that what all problems can amorous causes lead to, and what mighty contests rise from trivial things. I sing this verse to Carol. So Carol has also been referred to here. And it's important that every person who has a role to play in the poem, he or she finds a mention. So the poet has referred to John Carroll here. And he says, I sing this verse to Carroll, muse is due. This even Belinda might vouchsafe to view. Slight is the subject, but not so the praise, if she inspire and he approve my lays. Again, you see that the poet here is trying to present himself in utmost humility. And these are all pretentious. That all this aspect about him being so humble, constantly asking for people's permission, we will get to know that these are mere posturing, that he has to behave in a certain way, because decorum is an important defining feature of this age. So they have to be decorous, and the poet is following decorum. He, once again, even though he has dedicated this poem to Arabella Fermor, he has written an entire preface for her. Yet, at the beginning of the poem also, he mentions her. Here she is being mentioned as a fictional character. Please mute yourself. She is being mentioned as a fictional character. She has already been named Belinda here. Now, she has been named Belinda because, again, Arabella Fermor's nickname was Belle. Now, Belle is a common reference for beauty, for girl, but she also had this nickname. So it's supposed that Belinda was a derivative of the nickname she already had. And the poet says that the subject of this poem may be slight, but the praise, but not so the praise. And he seeks the approval of both Belinda and John Carroll to set out to write what he wants to go ahead with. Say what strange motive, goddess, could compel a well-bred lord to assault a gentle belle. Oh, say what stranger cause, yet unexplored, could make a gentle belle reject a lord in task so bold can little men engage, and in soft bosom dwell such mighty rage. So now this poem is trying to work with contradictions. So you see that two different opposing ideas are being juxtaposed together, and out of this juxtaposition the poet is trying to bring about a certain kind of effect. So he is not taking sides. He is neither taking Arabella Fermor's side nor is he taking Lord Peter's side, and yet he wants to placate both the sides and wants to occasion and a reconciliation. So it's not a usual kind of invocation either. Although he's invoking the muse, the subject of his wonder is as to how could somebody inflict violence on a gentle maid. I mean, Lord Peter. Okay, fine. Sorry. First, we have to go into the trivial incident as that led. That the poem is all about. Let me just briefly explain it to you. So the actual incident was that this girl, Arabella Fermor, and Lord Peter, they were at Hampton Court, even in reality, and Lord Peter had chopped off a ring of her hair. And that became a matter of outrage, and it was purportedly a cause for dishonor. So the families, the girl's family, it felt dishonored, and they wanted an apology from Lord Peter's family. So this is what the violence was: the snipping of Arabella Fermor's curl. Here, the poet is wondering as to what could have led a man to inflict such a violence on a gentle belle, and yet, at the same time, he is also wonderstruck as to how could a belle, how could a girl have refused how could she have refused? How could she have rejected a man? So that is also again a matter of wonder for him. So both of it is what Pope is wondering about. And then he wants to say that how can men engage in such little tasks, and how can rage dwell in such soft bosoms in woman's heart? So this is an age where we had very fixed gendered ideas about male and female. So even though this age did not believe that it could have the kind of virtues and honor that was shown in epic poetry, yet there was a definable honor that men had to adhere to, and the female gender also, she had to conform to the standards that were ascribed to femininity. And therefore the poet is rather surprised as to how could a gentle belle have such rage in her heart. All that has already happened. Arabella Fermor was quite enraged after her hair was snipped. Soul through white curtains shot a timorous ray and opt those eyes that must eclipse the day. Now lapdogs give themselves a rousing shake, and sleepless lovers just at 12 awake. Thrice rung the bell, the slipper knocked the ground, and pressed watch returned a silver sound. Belinda still her downy pillow pressed. So you see that in the second stanza, we are being introduced to a scene where the heroine of the poem, she continues to sleep while the sun rays, the beams of sun rays are filtering through her room. And the poet here, it's almost mid-afternoon and the heroine is sleeping. So right at the start, the poet shows the level of decadence that is prevailing in this particular 18th century England, that people continue to sleep through the mid of the afternoon. And Belinda will wake up very lazily. And as she wakes up, she calls for her attendants. The attendants are also not responding. And the poet then says that they have also been imitating the mores and manners of their masters. So they have also become similar to them. And she has a lap dog. So that was also one of the characteristics of woman in this age, that she would always be accompanied by a lap dog. And it's the lap dog who is trying to wake her up initially. Now, again, as per the epic feature, this poem will also have an omen, that when you read the epic poetry, whether it was Homer's Iliad, Virgil's Aeneid, there would be an omen, there would be signs which were read or interpreted by a sire or a sage, and they foretold the future. In this particular poem, since we have sylphs instead of gods and goddesses, the sylphs would make that interpretation. And Belinda, and similar to the epic form, where the hero would have a guardian god or goddess, here Belinda also had a guardian angel called Ariel. So Ariel, right at the beginning of the poem, Ariel would try to warn Belinda about the future that awaited her. He gives her a dream, and in that dream, he warns her about the oncoming events of the day. The morning dream that hovered over her head, a youth more glittering than the birthnight bow, that even in slumber caused her cheeks to glow, seemed to her ear his waning lips to lay, and thus in whispers said, or seemed to say, fairest of mortals, thou distinguished care of thousand bright inhabitants of air, if ever one vision touched thy infant thought, of all the nurse and all the priest have taught, of airy elves and moonlight shadows seen. And then he goes on to say, so what he tries, I mean, Ariel, her guardian angel, Belinda's guardian angel, is trying to warn her of a certain man, which might a certain man who might become the cause for her downfall, who might bring about problems for her. But once she's visited by this dream, Belinda goes back to sleep. Again, she's getting that morning sleep because she wants to prolong that dream. And after she wakes up, we see that she's surrounded by a number of trivialities. There are several trivial stuffs surrounding her on her bed. And amongst those trivial stuff, there would also be a pile of billet doux, love letters that she has been receiving from her suitors, from her admirers. And as she would start reading those, she will forget about her dream. And one more thing, that while she's still sleeping, her guardian angel somehow is able to, he's able to detect, he's able to figure out that Belinda does harbor a kind of desire for some mortal. So now you see that even when you read Eve of St. Agnes, and it comes later in the 19th century, we see that the girl, she is allowed to have visions of a lover. Here also, Belinda is allowed to have a vision of a lover, but that lover shouldn't be a mortal lover. Her guardian angel, on the other hand, perceives that she has some kind of a desire about some mortal being. That's when he will be dumbstruck, he will be shocked, and would almost abandon Belinda. Hmm. Yeah. Just wait a second. Okay. Do you have the poem with you? I could have shared my screen and shown the poem. Yeah. So even at the start of this poem, when we saw that the poet is okay, yeah, fine. So when we see that the poet makes elaborate description of the nature of how the sun filters through the window. Now, again, this elaboration of the natural aspect, this elaboration of the description of sunrise is not for the purpose of the portrayal of nature. Not He's not making this description to portray the glory of nature, but to comment, by way of implication, the decadence of high society London, where members of this high society, they continue to sleep till noon. And even when the sun casts its rays upon her, it doesn't awaken her. I mean, she's not in any kind of hurry to wake up. Rather, it makes her more irritable. She becomes impatient and irritable. She rings the bell thrice. And once there is, even to that, there is no response. And yeah. So one airy spirit who has been introduced is Ariel. He appears in Belinda's dream and he appears as a handsome youth. And he's somebody who's also trying to prolong Belinda's balmy rest by taking her to a different world. So here there is an emphasis on the airiness of these creatures, of these spirits, which is highlighted by referring to them as airy selves, airy elves, and they are unnumbered sprites as light as air. Yeah. So, in as per Rosicrucian philosophy, and even when you come to read this poem, there are different kinds of spirits, sprites that we are going to encounter in this poem, and all these sprites, they have their origin in the female. Um, they were initially female, and then later on, after their death, they turn into sprites. They After their death, they leave the female body and they move into air. However, their vanities do not end after their death. So if you come to line 55, there are different kinds of airy spirits that Pope is talking about: salamanders, nymphs, gnomes, and sylphs. And each one of them have their own characteristic features. And they were of a particular time while they were alive, and later on they acquired similar corresponding characteristics after their death. So Ariel would be the one who will introduce all these other selves, and he goes on to describe them in details. He says that soul of termagant, it returns to the element of fire. Now, you would know that in an earlier age, the earth, it was considered to be made of different elements. That the earth, the human body, it was all considered to be a mixture of different elements, which were air, earth, fire, and water. And as it made up a person's nature, it was thought that any kind of any kind of the level of any of these would determine the predominant nature of a person. So they had to be in a certain kind of balance. And if there was any kind of disbalance, that would determine the predominant nature of a person. And similar to these elements, the sylphs, the airy spirits, are also of that type. So the termogen's soul, it returns to the element of fire because they are made of a fiery temper. So they are given the name salamanders. The soul of mild-tempered woman, it belongs to the element of water. So they become nymphs. The soul of prude ladies, it takes the form of earth, which is tied down to earth. And the soul of coquettes turn into sylphs that inhabit the lower sky, and they belong to the element of the sky. So these are the supernatural machinery which we are going to find in this poem. Yeah, so I think that this is the introduction. I'll have to go through the first canto once again. I would ask you to first read the canto yourself so that in the next class, I do not have to read through the lines. I'll give you a summary of it and then we'll focus on certain lines. So just read the first canto once and we will have the first as well as second canto in the next class. Yeah. So if you have any doubts, if you have any questions, please unmute yourself and ask. Unmute yourself. Nobody?